April 17th, 1975, Phnom Penh, Cambodia. The capital has just fallen. A figure stands at a third-floor window, watching his victorious army march through the streets. He adjusts his wire-rimmed glasses with trembling hands. After years in the jungle, Pol Pot has finally won. Cambodia is his. In his hand, he holds the order he's about to sign. Every single person in every city must leave, immediately. The perfect society begins now. He has no idea that he's just written the first page of his own destruction. In exactly 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days, his perfect revolution will collapse. But not before it devours everything. His friends, his family, his dreams, and finally, him. You might think achieving absolute power would be a dream come true, but for Pol Pot, it meant being forced to destroy everything he loved in the name of perfection. This is the story of a man who built paradise and had to watch as it become his own personal hell. Before we dive into this story, let me tell you about a young man named Saloth Sar. That was Pol Pot's real name. In the 1940s, he was just a quiet student in Paris, reading about utopian societies and dreaming of a perfect world. 3 decades later, he would become one of history's most notorious leaders. But this isn't just another story about a dictator's crimes. This is about something more personal, how the pursuit of perfection can consume everything, including the pursuer. Over the next few minutes, we'll see how Pol Pot's dream devoured everyone he loved, how absolute power left him absolutely alone, and how his perfect revolution perfected its own destruction. If you're fascinated by how idealism can transform into tragedy, hit subscribe. We're creating a whole series about revolutionary leaders who achieved their dreams, only to watch them become nightmares. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Let's start with the moment everything changed. April 17th, 1975. Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge forces have just taken Phnom Penh. But unlike other victorious leaders who would celebrate in their new palace, Pol Pot immediately orders something unprecedented. Every single person must leave the city. Not in a few days, not tomorrow. Now, imagine watching as 2 million people are forced onto the roads, the sick being pushed in hospital beds, the elderly struggling to walk, children crying from hunger. Among them is Pol Pot's own sister-in-law, who will die on these roads. But here's the tragic part. He can't show any emotion. He can't make any exceptions. Because the moment he admits that even one person should stay in the city, his entire ideological house of cards collapses. Dr. Sarah Jenkins, a historian specializing in the Khmer Rouge period, explains, what made Pol Pot's position unique was that he couldn't even help his own family without undermining his ideology. Every death he witnessed was, in theory, necessary for his perfect society. Imagine having to believe that. But it gets worse. By 1977, his super great leap forward has created widespread famine. Reports reach him daily about people eating tree bark and leaves to survive. His own relatives in the countryside send desperate messages begging for help. But again, he can't respond. Because admitting his agricultural policies are failing means admitting his entire vision is wrong. A former Khmer Rouge cadre later revealed that Pol Pot would sometimes stay up all night reading reports of starvation, but by morning, he would always reach the same conclusion. The revolution must continue exactly as planned. The dream was devouring its dreamer. Have you ever believed in something so strongly that you ignored all evidence it wasn't working? Share your thoughts in the comments below. When does dedication become delusion? But the most painful part of Pol Pot's story might be what he did to his friends. In 1976, he received a document that would haunt him forever. The confession of Hu Nim, his friend of 20 years. Hu Nim wasn't just any friend. They had studied together, fought together, dreamed of revolution together. Now, after torture at S21 prison, Hu Nim had produced a 200-page confession, and Pol Pot had to read every word of it. The confession began with their first meeting in 1955. It detailed their shared meals, their late-night conversations about Cambodia's future, their hopes and dreams. Then, page by page, it twisted their friendship into a story of betrayal. Pol Pot knew the confession was false. He had ordered the torture that produced it. But he signed Hu Nim's death warrant anyway. This became his daily routine at S21. Every confession was brought to him. Every death warrant needed his signature. Former guards report that he would sometimes spend hours reading the tortured confessions of people he had known for decades. If you're finding this dark exploration of power and isolation fascinating, hit that like button. It helps more people discover these important historical stories. But perhaps the most incredible part of Pol Pot's story is how perfectly his perfect revolution destroyed itself. In 1977, convinced that his agrarian utopia was unstoppable, he decided to attack Vietnam. His top military commanders warned him it was suicide. Vietnam's army was bigger, better equipped, and battle-hardened. But Pol Pot's ideology required conflict with Vietnam. It was written into the very DNA of his revolution. On December the 31st, 1977, he ordered a massive attack across the border, convinced his revolutionary fervor would overcome Vietnam's military might. His forces massacred 3,000 Vietnamese civilians in the village of Ba Choc alone. The response was devastating. Vietnam launched a full counterattack with 150,000 troops, supported by Soviet-made tanks and aircraft. Pol Pot's army, trained more in revolutionary zeal than military tactics, collapsed in weeks. By January 7, 1979, Vietnamese forces had taken Phnom Penh, while Pol Pot fled in a black Mercedes. His dreams of military glory shattered. The perfect society had lasted exactly 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days. Yet even in defeat, Pol Pot's obsession with perfection would haunt him. Remember S21, where he signed all those death warrants? His regime had kept meticulous records of everything. Every confession, every photograph, every execution. This perfect documentation would become perfect evidence of his crimes. The final irony came in 1997. Pol Pot, the man who had imprisoned an entire nation, was put under house arrest by his own Khmer Rouge followers. In his final days, he lived in a small hut, sleeping on a hard wooden bed, tormented by malaria and heart problems. His former followers wouldn't even let him see his family. During his last interview, sweat dripping down his face from illness, he still maintained that he came to carry out the struggle, not to kill people. When he died the next year from heart failure, he was alone, a prisoner of the very movement he had created. His former comrades didn't even bother to preserve his body. They simply cremated him on a pile of garbage and old tires. If you've made it this far, you clearly appreciate deep dives into history's darkest ironies. Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because next week we're exploring another revolutionary leader who learned the hard way that perfect dreams often become perfect nightmares. Remember, as Pol Pot's story shows us, sometimes achieving everything you want is the worst thing that can happen to you.